Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And welcome to the 2017 Heron J. Mitchell Benjamin A. Quarles African American History Month Convocation. We thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule this morning from your classes and other activities to be with us. As we join the rest of the nation, in celebrating the history, the heritage, the legacy, and the achievements of African Americans. I'm also pleased this morning to welcome you to the Sesquicentennial celebration of Morgan State University. Throughout this calendar year, Morgan will celebrate its 150th anniversary as an institution of learning in the state of Maryland. The theme of our celebration is purpose, progress, promise. And we will spend the entire year looking back at our beginning, noting and rejoicing at our progress and development over the past 150 years, and reaffirming our potential to grow the future and lead the world as one of this nation's premier institutions of higher learning. We began our celebration in December of 2017 when we hosted a special worship service at Sharp Street Memorial United Methodist Church, where Morgan was born and where we held our first classes in 1867. That ceremony was followed by a special Sesquicentennial Morgan State University Choir Christmas concert. And on December 16th, 2017, Morgan held its first Sesquicentennial commencement exercises, at which the university issued a degree to its 50,000th graduate. Today, in our 150th year, Morgan has now a total of 50,177 graduates. That deserves an applause, I think. And finally, on Christmas Day, we held a proclamation ceremony celebrating the first meeting of the founding Board of Trustees of the Centenary Biblical Institute on December 25th of 1866. And so for the remainder of 2017, Morgan will hold a variety of activities celebrating our 150th anniversary. These activities are designed to bring our alumni, former and retired employees, community supporters and friends together with our current students, faculty, administration, and staff in a kind of great family reunion to celebrate our collective achievements. At the end of your program booklet, you will find a list of the activities to be held in February and March, and you may visit our upcoming website for a more detailed list of activities. Our website is 150.morgan.edu. I want you students to look especially at forthcoming announcements about a number of student and alumni competitions that you may want to enter. We're going to have a Sesquicentennial song competition, an essay contest, an oratorical contest, and a Sesquicentennial Poet Laureate competition. I also want to bring to your attention your chance to inscribe your name permanently in the history of Morgan State University by purchasing a permanent brick in the Sesquicentennial Plaza to be constructed on the walkway from the Frederick Douglass statue in front of Holmes Hall to the Welcome Bridge, all on the academic quad. This project is also described on the last page of your program booklet. Finally, and believe it, this is finally, I want to announce to you and to seek your support for a special week, April 16 through 22nd, 2017, when Morgan will hold a joint celebration with the 8 other historically black colleges and universities that are celebrating their sesquicentennial this year. They are Alabama State University at Montgomery, Barbara Scotia College, Fayetteville State University, Howard University, Johnson C. Smith University, Morehouse College, St. Augustine's University, and Talladega College. This HBCU 9, that's what we're calling ourselves, will bring those 9 institutions to the Baltimore, Washington area on those dates for a joint celebration. So look out for details about that celebration on our website as well. We hope that this sesquicentennial celebration will be Morgan's finest hour, and we invite you to be active participants in all aspects of it. So welcome to our African American History Month Convocation, and welcome to our sesquicentennial celebration. Before I end, I would like to note the presence in the audience of the president of Morgan State University, Dr. David Wilson. Where is he? Has he gotten here yet? Dr. Wilson just got in on a plane a few minutes ago and will have to leave in the midst of this convocation for another commitment. We want to thank Dr. Wilson for all of the great work that he does for Morgan State University. The program will proceed without further interruption from me as outlined in your program booklet on pages 28 and 29. Please note that the first 25 pages of the booklet are historical data on the university, and you should review and visit those data at your leisure. We shall begin with invocation by the Reverend Dr. Bernard Keels, Dean of the University Memorial Chapel, followed by the singing of Lift Every Voice and Sing, led by the Morgan State University Choir, conducted by Dr. Eric Conway, and then we will proceed as outlined in the booklet. Welcome.
Let us pray. O wise and amiable God, we bow before you with our spirits full of wonder, praise, and adoration. We proudly remember our ancestors who fought to change the world in order to grow the future. These heroic pathfinders carved out of history from the stubborn stones that made the load so very heavy. From days of trampled darkness, you gave vision to those blinded by prejudice and abuse. You ushered in the marvelous light. From the history of yesterday, you have put your hand to the plow to assure there will be a history of tomorrow. Wash our tongues, lest we forget where we came from. We give you thanks, O God, for the teachers, the leaders and friends and family, even the enemies who have helped us shape our presence. For trials and tribulations, for stumbling blocks turned to stepping stones, we are higher educated. On this sacred morning, we recommit ourselves to the struggle for justice and equality, not just for the people we know, but to all who yet taste the bitter herb of marginalization. O God, our God, help us to put the time in, for payday is coming. Amen.
Amen. Just 5 decades removed from the institution of slavery. Woodson left Chicago both inspired and on a mission. He endeavored to establish an organization purposed in promoting research, preserving, interpreting, and disseminating information about Black life and culture to the global community. On September 9th, 1915, what we know today as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, was born. What most don't know is that what we celebrate today as Black History Month got off to a very, very rocky start. Understand that visionaries like Dr. Woodson often have great difficulty in finding others who can see their vision. By 1920, Dr. Woodson found himself urging African American civic organizations, social orders, and secret societies to join him and ASALH in promoting the achievements of African Americans. As fate, or maybe good fortune would have it, Dr. Woodson was a member of the Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. When he sought help, it was his fraternity that was the first to heed his call. A man named Linwood Graves Coger was initiated into Omega Psi Phi by way of its Alpha chapter on the campus of Howard University. Upon completing his undergraduate studies, Coger remained at Howard and earned a law degree. Coger and his brother, A. Briscoe Coger, also an Omega, also a Howard graduate, relocated to Baltimore City and opened a law practice. Now, if the name Coger sounds familiar to you, it should, There have been several generations of Coger that have graduated from Morgan. If you have an opportunity to pick up the next issue of the Morgan magazine, there's a dynamic article written by Dr. Toya Corbett on the pioneering achievements of Ann Coger, Linwood Coger's niece. By marriage, the Coger family is also related to the family of George William Frederick Mcmechen, for whom Morgan's first School of Business building is named. But I digress. Linwood Graves Coger established Pi Chapter of Omega Psi Phi here on the campus of Morgan College in Carnegie Hall in 1923. When Dr. Woodson began to solicit support, it was Coger and the Omegas of Pi Chapter who were the first to heed his call. On behalf of the fraternity, Coger petitioned what was then the Negro Public Schools of Baltimore City and was granted permission to bring members of Pi Chapter into the schools and present Dr. Woodson's research. This was the first structured, systematic observance of Black history, and it began in this city with Omega men, Morgan men from this campus. Y'all missed that. It began in this city with Morgan men from this campus. By 1927, the National Fraternity adopted the program using the Baltimore City model. The program was called National Negro Achievement Week. The Omegas have maintained the program to the present and celebrate Achievement Week every November, the month of the fraternity's founding. Today, while we honor Dr. Carter G. Woodson and his vision, fully conceived into fruition, we would be remiss as Morganites if we did not also acknowledge the Morgan men, the Omega men, who were the first to heed Woodson's call for help and saw to it that a week-long celebration in November in the 1920s would become a month-long international celebration in February. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was indeed the father of Black History Month. However, Morgan was the unsung godfather that ensured that Negro Achievement Week was trained up to the fully grown and healthy Black History Month that we celebrate around the world today.
We will sing a Moses Hogan arrangement of Ride On King Jesus with Kaya Wright as a soloist.
Ride on, King Jesus, ride on, no I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Wilson, who just joined us. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I am honored to introduce a distinguished Morgan alumnus, a beloved Eastern Shore citizen, a descendant of Reverend Samuel Greene, who plays a vital role in the founding of Morgan State University, a colleague and a friend. I have known Mr. Dale Greene for close to 10 years now, since I became Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning in January of 2008. Throughout the years, I have seen him evolve from a newly minted graduate who had completed his master's degree of architecture and historic preservation from the University of Illinois to a preservation icon in the state of Maryland and the country. He has accomplished much. Among a few of his many distinguished work include an inventory of historic African American churches in the Eastern Shore, the rediscovery of the Hill community in Easton, Maryland, the oldest free African American neighborhood in the United States, a historical study of Morgan Park and Wilson Park, two significant Black neighborhoods in Baltimore, a study of American Black architects, and of course, a study of the historic core of our campus, starting with our Memorial Chapel, a symbolic icon for student life. Because of these compelling discoveries and invaluable knowledge, Professor Greene has been invited to serve on many prestigious boards, like the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, Maryland Historic Trust, Preservation Maryland, and the Reed's Drugstore and Commemoration Design Committee. He has also been interviewed and written about by national media like NPR, ABC News, C-SPAN, Fox News, and dozens more media outlets. There are too many accomplishments to name here among his more than 20 or 30 awards and recognitions. But there are two things that to us are very important. He has spearheaded our love of historic preservation, particularly preservation of Black heritage. He has been especially impactful on our students who have now been grounded on their heritage and are very proud of it. Dale has undoubtedly been the best champion for the preservation of African American heritage and places. It was through his hard work and reputation that Morgan State University received the designation of a national treasure, the only academic campus on that list. We are so proud to have him in our midst. He is a mover and a shaker and a fireball. Please welcome Professor Dale Greene.
Good morning. I first want to bring greetings on behalf of the School of Architecture and Planning, where I'm a professor, and thank Dr. Akers, our dean, for that wonderful introduction. And to President Wilson, thank you for joining us. I know that you'll have to leave shortly, but it's always an honor to have you in our midst. I am honored today to speak to all of you on behalf of our Sesquicentennial as we celebrate this year more than 150 years of a remarkable journey here at Morgan State University. And I'm equally honored to speak at our Curls-Mitchell Convocation, where at Morgan we celebrate all year long the rich African American history and culture here at our own institution. You can advance my next slide, it might help. Okay, thanks. Dr. Johnson stated that the ASALH, the Association of the Study of African American Life and History, sets the national theme of Black history every year. This year's national theme is that of the crisis of Black education. It's most unique that we are celebrating our Sesquicentennial this year with this major theme on Black education. And I am equally excited to serve as a dean, as mentioned, on the Maryland Commission of African American History and Culture, where I'm vice chair, and most proud of our our alum, none other than the Honorable Senator Verda Welcome, who in 1969 wrote the legislation and the statute that created the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And she was assisted by our most noted African American historian, Dr. Benjamin Curls, who did the statewide study for this major commission. Next slide, please. I want to make you aware that C-SPAN came on our campus last year to do a live recording with our students on a lecture that I delivered on the history of Morgan State University and the significance of being named a national treasure. C-SPAN will release that live recording on Saturday, February 18th at 8 p.m. C-SPAN, and then again 12 midnight. That also will run in perpetuity in their live archive, and I would encourage you to look at that to learn more about our history and our culture as it relates to Morgan State University. Next slide, please. This morning I'm going to speak on Morgan, a National Treasure, Architecture as Artifact, connecting the story of race, place, time, and identity. Next slide, please. We are celebrating our Sesquicentennial, our 150th anniversary, and we are doing this with 8 other institutions. They have been mentioned earlier today, and of course you can see them now on the slide. It was the 1965 Act of the Higher Education Act, rather, that defined these 105 HBCUs. Most significant, these 9 were the largest concentration of HBCUs ever founded in any single year of 1867. And so we are so honored to be celebrating this year along with our sister institutions. Next slide, please. I'm equally honored, as it's been mentioned, to be a descendant of Reverend Samuel Greene Sr. He is my 6th great-grandfather, and I want to credit President Wilson, who was the first to invoke his name here on this campus and to more formally recognize him. He is a very significant individual who was born in 1802 on Maryland's Eastern Shore, enslaved, but purchased his freedom in 1834 and then that of his wife in 1843. Unfortunately, he was unable to purchase the freedom of his 2 children, but he was able to assist his son, Sam Greene Jr., in escaping to Canada. He was also assisted by his first cousin, Harriet Tubman. They are all in the same family. Reverend Greene was a very significant preacher, early preacher in the Methodist Episcopal Church, and a highly respected Underground Railroad conductor. He, in 1857, was caught with a pamphlet, the Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was illegal, a book that he had, and he was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison here in Baltimore City, where he served half that term and was pardoned by Governor Bradford, who was a Christian governor and highly respected Reverend Sam Greene. And afterwards, he spent much of his time working to assist with the development of what we now call Morgan State University. I reference from Langston Hughes, whose birthday was on yesterday, one of his very important books that he penned in 1943, Freedom's Plow. I'm always reminded of Freedom's Plow when I think about Reverend Greene's legacy. In essence, there are a couple things I would pull from Freedom's Plow. First, in the heart starts a dream. Then from the mind, it moves to find a way. And then the hands seek other hands. And then a community of hands work to build. And it is all of these hands that we are recognizing this year. His hands to other hands that were free, hands that were enslaved, hands that were white, hands that were black, hands that were old, and hands that were young. Reverend Greene is only one of the African-American founders that we have now uncovered and that we are recognizing. He is the only one that we have a picture of, but we know that his early efforts from 1852 leading up to 1864 were instrumental in bringing the other hands together to create this great institution that we now know as Morgan State University. And so we're very, very, very grateful to have uncovered his legacy and his story. Next slide. In October 31 of 1864, Reverend Greene, along with our 4 other major African-American founders, Reverend James Harper, James Peck, Elijah Grissom, and forgetting somebody a second here. I'm having a little senior moment even as a young person. But those 4 others, James Harper rather, worked with Reverend Samuel Greene to create the Delaware Conference as well as the Washington Conference, which was the conference under the Methodist Episcopal Church that actually created what we call what was then the Centenary Biblical Institute that later became Morgan State University. December 25th of 1866, and as it was mentioned, we more formally recognized this last year with the ringing of the bell ceremony. The founding trustees of the Centenary Biblical Institute met. These were the white individuals that Bishop Levi Scott of the Methodist Episcopal Church ordained to become the founding trustees of our institution. On April 30th of 1867, the first class of 9 students met at the Sharp Street Methodist Episcopal Church downtown, and November 27th of 1867 was when the Articles of Incorporation of the Centenary Biblical School Institute was founded. And so 1867 marks our founding as the Centenary Biblical Institute. 1890 marks when we become the 4-year liberal arts college as a result of Reverend Littleton Morgan's donation and endowment of this institution to become the first African-American in the state of Maryland, to 1939 when the state purchased Morgan College and it became Morgan State College, to 1975 when Morgan State College was granted the university status. Next slide. Our early beginnings began in the basement of this building, which was located at Lombard and Pratt Street at Sharp Street Methodist Episcopal Church. The original 9 students met and convened for what they called a systematic course of lectures at this site. Unfortunately, today, this site no longer exists. There's a Days Inn hotel erected on this site, but we will be erecting a historical marker to pay homage to our early history at this site. Next slide. They moved to 44 East Saratoga Street. The site was purchased in 1869. At this site, they remained as the Centenary Biblical Institute, but they also started what was originally the Baltimore City Academy. It later became the Morgan Academy, which was our preparatory school at this location. It was a very important historic African-American community, originally a free black community called Gallo Hills. We also understand that Bowie was formed out of this community as well, and Coppin. And so the 4 HBCUs of Maryland, in essence, have their roots here, as you will learn that UMES was birthed out of Morgan. Next slide. In 1890, the Morgan College is founded, the Centenary Biblical Institute in 1879 through Reverend John Goucher purchased this site at the corner of Edmondson and Fulton. This very large structure was designed by Frank Davis and was constructed in 1881. The college now had its first primary campus structure and building at this site. It remained at this site until 1965 when the building was demolished. We were located at this site up until 1917 when we moved to the present site. Next slide. The University of Maryland Eastern Shore today was founded as the Delaware Conference Academy and then was more formally known as the Princess Anne Academy. It was a branch of the then Centenary Biblical Institute and then became a branch of Morgan College. The original campus would have been located in what is today the Academic Oval on UMES's campus. The original buildings, some of which are featured in the image off to the left. Only Hall was the first building where the 9 students on this campus had their first classes, and then there were more than 15 structures that Morgan developed on this campus. Unfortunately, in 1959, the last structure that Morgan created on this campus was actually demolished. If you go to the next slide, the fire image that you saw was this building that was being fire-induced. And this removed the last remaining tangible symbol to what was Morgan College and the branch of the Princess Anne Academy. Next slide. Morgan continued to develop institutions. It developed the Virginia Collegiate Industrial Institute in Lynchburg, Virginia in 1891. And by 1893, this similar building that you see here, the same building that was at Edmondson and Fulton, the same architect, Frank Davis, was commissioned to design a building in Lynchburg, Virginia to be the major campus building for that site. It was a 12-acre site that existed from 1891 to 1917. 100 years later, in December of this year, will be the anniversary of that site. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by fire in December, and we recognize the heroic efforts of Harriet Wolford, who saved all of the faculty and the students from that fire and from that devastation. She later died of pneumonia. Our Wolford Infirmary on this campus is named in her honor. Next slide. That brings us to this site, where for 100 years this year, June 1st, we would have been at this site, and it will mark our centennial. When Morgan purchased this site, as you can see in the image, it was a farm. It was the Ivy Mill and Farm. It was owned by Walter Thorne, who was a German immigrant. And so from 1917 to 1939, we have been Morgan College on this site. From 1939 to 1975, we have been Morgan State College. And from 1975 to present, we have been Morgan State University. This is the only historical site that we have that speaks to our 150 years of history that is still fully intact. All of the other sites that I have shown you have been demolished and or have different uses. Next slide, please. These are early images of the site as a farm. And so Morgan's campus was a farm. Its chief crop was what was referred to as Baltimore gneiss, which is a stone that they quarried here on the site. And many of the early buildings that you will see were actually quarried from the stones on this site. Next slide. The early Ivy Mill buildings, such as Washington Hall, which was originally the Ivy Hotel, was renamed in honor of that Washington Conference, which was the first African-American conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church. And so Morgan began its naming process with this building, and they named it in honor of the very conference that gave rise to the institution. Next slide. Bellevue Hall was one of the early buildings that was here prior to our coming, and it was a part of the Morton Estate acquisition. Next slide. And then there were some critical dates that I want to share about our moving to this site. When we moved to this site, it was Baltimore County. It became Baltimore City as a part of the last annexation in 1918. But the area surrounding this site legally barred Jews and African Americans from living in this site. In 1913, prior to coming here, a group of colored men formed an organization that would create what would be called the Morgan Park Development Corporation. And their chief goal was to find a site of 50 acres such that they could divide 25 acres for a housing community and the other 25 acres for the campus. And so this dream of having a Morgan Park community was something that goes back to 1913 and actually predates coming to this campus. Later, I'll show you some newspaper articles that show the opposition that they endured trying to purchase properties in other parts of the city of Baltimore, where they were also legally barred from living. But in 1917, upon purchasing this, they were able to carve out 25 acres of the original 65 acres of land to create Morgan Park Community, which is celebrating its centennial today. Next slide. These early articles just show a sampling of the opposition that Morgan endured as it tried to purchase campuses across the city of Baltimore. They looked in Park Heights where they were also opposed. They looked at Mount Washington, where they were also opposed. And of course, they went through a great deal of opposition here, and they went all the way up to the highest levels of court. But they were very successful. And the article that I love the most, of course, is the one on the end that says Morgan College is again a victor, because it had endured many obstacles and trials to get to this point. Next slide. The Morgan Park community that I was referencing is east of our campus, and you can see main campus with the Carnegie Hall and Science Complex and O'Connell Hall, and then just east of that is the Morgan Park community, where there are 95 houses to this day that reflect that historical legacy. Next slide. Morgan Park was developed in 1917, 100 years ago this year, and some of its early pioneering residents were Carl J. Murphy, who was a charter member of our board, and also it's our first African-American chairman, but also the noted Dr. W.B. Du Bois bought a lot and had a home designed in Morgan Park and lived there for nearly 2 decades. Next slide. The first home that was built in Morgan Park was connected to Morgan from the beginning. Dr. Preservio O'Connell, who was the former principal of the Princess Anne Academy, which was the branch of Morgan College, when he was hired by John Spencer to come to Morgan College, he actually had his home built in this community. It was finished in 1921, and he joined the faculty here as a professor of history. His home is the oldest house in Morgan Park community. Next slide. Both Morgan Park as well as Wilson Park are early African-American city suburbs. These two communities were created at the same time, 1917, one through Morgan's efforts and the other through the efforts of a noted African-American banker and insuranceman, Harry O. Wilson, who just west of our campus created an entire community where other African-Americans affiliated with our campus resided, such as Dr. Nick Aaron Ford and Dr. Turpin and many others, our graduates, Ashby Hawkins, and the list goes on and on. Next slide. Carnegie Hall is our oldest building that we constructed on this campus. It was completed in 1919. It was through the gift of Andrew Carnegie, and it was designed by his architect from New York, Edward Tilden. Next slide. And there are 2 other buildings that are associated with that gift, as well as his architect. Edward Tilden also designed this building that most people are unfamiliar with, which is the old power plant. It was designed and constructed to power the Carnegie Hall as well as Baldwin Hall. Next slide. Baldwin Hall is our oldest dormitory that is still in continuous use, and it was also designed by Edward Tilden, who was Andrew Carnegie's architect. So these 3 buildings are connected to that legacy of Andrew Carnegie, and it was one of his last gifts. He didn't live to see either of these 3 buildings constructed, and so these buildings speak very uniquely nationally to Andrew Carnegie's support. Next slide. The original Sopra Library, which we now call the Banneker Hall, was a building that was constructed in 1939, coinciding with Morgan State College, the purchase from Morgan College to Morgan State College. Next slide. Tubman Hall in 1940. This is the first building on our campus that was a landmark building. It cost the university $100,000, which in 1940 was a significant amount of money. And it was also our first building on the campus that was designed by an African-American architect, Albert Irvin Cassell. Next slide. The University Memorial Chapel followed in 1941 and was also designed by the same architect, Albert Irvin Cassell. And it is a building that wasn't originally a part of Morgan State University, but was acquired in 2008 more formally and is now known as the University Memorial Chapel. Next slide. Truth Hall was constructed in 1946, and this is its construction photograph. It was originally constructed as a dormitory and then later became an administration building. Next slide. The campus model of 1948 is most unique. It's the only record of a campus model that we have for Morgan State University. It is also most unique that it shows our first African-American president to the right, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, along with Dr. Martin Jenkins, who followed him in his presidency. And here the 2 are discussing the campus model. And in the model, you can see that Dr. Holmes is pointing to the W.A.C. Hughes Stadium, which is named in honor of William Alfred Carroll Hughes, who introduced football to Morgan and also was a bishop in the Methodist Episcopal Church. And the stadium was erected in 1937. But in this campus model, you can see that they were building out, or planning rather, the build out of what mostly exists here at Morgan State University. And most significant was to be the iconic building, the building with the bell tower or the clock tower, Holmes Hall, which would be named in honor of our first African-American president, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, in 1949. Next slide. The Memorial Refectory, which was also in that model, was completed in 1949. This building no longer exists. This is where the Dixon Research Center is today. Next slide. The Hurt Gymnasium of 1952, which is named in honor of an alum as well as a legendary football coach, Edward Hurt. Next slide. Cummings Hall of 1952. Next slide. Callaway Hall of 1953. And these are early annexations to the Carnegie Hall and the other science annexations to that building. Next slide. And then Soldiers Armory, 1957. This building was at the location of where the present Student Center is today. It's designed by African-American architect Albert Cassell. Next slide. And then the original McKeldin Student Union. This is the McKeldin Student Union of 1958 on the site where the present McKeldin Student Union is today. Next slide. The original Murphy Fine Arts Auditorium, which was constructed in 1960, it was on the site of the present-day library. The Earl S. Richardson Library was built on that site. And when I was a student here at Morgan in 2001, in fact, that was where our first convocation was. So I was here long enough just to be able to experience this building, but many others that are older than I, of course, have many memories with this building. Next slide. The President's House was constructed in Morgan Park in 1963. The former president's homes were on the campus in the proximity of the present-day Student Center. Next slide. The Carter Grant Wilson Building, which was named in honor of the three horsemen, as they were referred to often at Morgan, James Carter, Dean Grant, and Edward Wilson. And this building was built in 1964. Next slide. O'Connell Hall, which is a building that's named in honor of Dr. Preservio O'Connell, whose home I showed you in Morgan Park. This building was built in 1964 and designed by Albert Irvin Cassell as well. Next slide. And this 1967 view of the campus. And so by 1967, if we were to go back to the 1948 campus model, you will see that the campus was largely built out reflecting that model that both Holmes and Jenkins were showing in the photo rather. And you will also see that the bridge, the Senator Verda Welcome Bridge, is appearing in this image from 1967. What's most unique with this image today is that we're celebrating our Sesquicentennial, and 50 years ago, 1967, the class of 1967 was celebrating the centennial. And for those that are here that are a part of the class of 2017, graduating in the Sesquicentennial class, you will return 50 years from now, and you will be celebrating with the bicentennial class. And so this is a very significant time in our history where we have the class of 1967 with the class of 2017 and the class of 2017 to return at the bicentennial. Next slide. The Hillfield House, constructed in 1969, and it was the last building designed by Albert Irvin Cassell as he died in 1969. This building was named in honor of the legendary basketball coach, Talmadge Hill. Next slide. Mcmechen Hall, which was named in honor of our first graduate, George Mcmechen, was completed in 1972, and this was the original business building. Next slide. Jenkins Hall of 1974 was named in honor of President Martin Jenkins, and was designed by Louis Fry, who was another significant African-American architect that designed the building on our campus. Next slide. The Sopra Library, which was recently demolished, constructed in 1975, only 3 of the original floors above grade were constructed. there were 5 additional floors that were to be constructed on that building, as you can see in the rendering down below. Next slide. The Mccelveen Student Center, similarly, only half of that building was constructed. It was to receive a dome as well as have the mirrored part of that building on the other side, which would be in the present parking lot that's below today. The bridge was to pierce through the dome and go to the other side of the quad. Next slide. Then we fast forward to some of our more modern buildings, like the present building today, the Murphy Fine Arts Building, which was being completed the year that I came as a freshman to Morgan State University in 2001. Next slide. And named in honor of Carl J. Murphy, our first African-American president. And then the Dixon Research Center of 2003, named in honor of Richard Dixon, who was the first African-American treasurer for the state of Maryland. Next slide. The Graves Business School, which has recently been completed in 2015 and is named in honor of our noted alum Earl Graves, who is the founder of Black Enterprise. Next slide. And to the Jenkins Behavioral Science Building, which is scheduled to open later in 2017 this year, which is named in honor of Dr. Martin Jenkins, our former president, and will replace the Jenkins on main campus. Both of these buildings are on historic sites of civil rights activity. The former Northwood Shopping Center location was a major site of civil rights activity during the 60s here at Morgan State University, where our students had sit-ins and protests and were also arrested, and you'll see that later. Next slide. We've had significant leaders who have guided this institution to the greatness that it has today. Some noted ones are, of course, Dr. John O. Spencer, who served the institution for a very long time and also brought in the cadre of our most noted African-American alum to join the faculty, most of which graduated 100 years ago last year in 1916. They were part of that class of 1916. The 3 horsemen that I mentioned, Carter, Grant, and Wilson, and many others were brought in under his legacy. He also secured a lot of the funding for the relocation to this site, as well as the building on this site. And then Dr. Dwight Oliver Wendell Holmes, who became our first African-American president in 1937, and Dr. Martin Jenkins, and Dr. Earl S. Richardson, who is the former president, and to our current president, President David Wilson. And then many noted trustees or regents, Reverend Dr. Littleton Morgan, who endowed the institution such that it would become a 4-year liberal arts college and become the first African-American college in the state of Maryland. And he also was, the institution rather, was also re-christened to be named in his honor as Morgan College. Dr. Carl J. Murphy, who was a charter member of our board and our first African-American chair, and to our first and only female African-American chair, Mrs. Agnolia P. McMillan, and to our current chair, the Honorable Kwasi Mfume. Next slide. And then to our noted early alum, our first female graduate, class of 1878, Susie Carr Love, where the University Memorial Chapel is named in her honor, was a graduate of the Centenary Biblical Institute, and Benjamin Oliver Byrd, who was the founding principal of the Princess Anne Academy, or the Delaware Conference Academy, which became the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Next slide. W. Ashby Hawkins and George Mcmechen became business partners in law. Both of them were Morgan alum. Ashby Hawkins, the Centenary Biblical Institute of 1881, and George Mcmechen, the Morgan College of 1895. Next. Zora Neale Hurston, Morgan Academy, class of 1918, noted author. And Bishop Edgar Amos Love, who was the founder of the Omega Psi Phi fraternity and was the last principal for the Morgan Academy. Next slide. And to the Morgan College student protests, starting in 1947, this one in Annapolis, Maryland. To the next slide. To the Reed's Drugstore sit-in in Baltimore in 1955, which has been declared as the first sit-in in the country, not the one in Greensboro, North Carolina. Next slide. And the rooftop restaurant in the Northwood Theater protests in Baltimore, Maryland, right across the street in 1963, where, as you can see in this ad, 218 Morgan students arrested and bale set. Very significant site where we were not able to participate in the establishments that were located once at that location. Next slide. James Carter, who was born on this site when it was the Ivy Mill and Farm, and graduated from our institution in 1916 and became the assistant to the president, was instrumental in our relocating to this site as well. He served 3 presidents during his time here at Morgan. Next slide. And he's noted as one of our 3 horsemen. George C. Grant, who was a former principal of our Morgan Academy, as well as chairman of the education department and dean of Morgan College. Next slide. And Edward Wilson, who was our longtime registrar and also university historian, who wrote our only present history of Morgan from 1867 to 1967. And we are writing a comprehensive history of Morgan this year. Next slide. To the early basketball team. And here you'll see, off to the far right, you will see Charles Drew, the Dr. Charles Drew, who acknowledges as one of his most significant accomplishments among blood plasma being his experience here at Morgan and his experience around the athletic department here at Morgan. Next slide. And to the early football team and to the W.A.C. Hughes Stadium, where all of our May commencements occur, very important landmark site, but then also to our legendary football team. Next slide. Dr. Scruggs, and to the founder of the Phi Beta Sigma chapter, which celebrated its centennial last year, was founded at the corner of Edmondson and Fulton while we were Morgan College, relocating to this site. And then we show, of course, their location here on the campus that is across from the Mccelveen Student Center. Next slide. The Iota Phi Theta Fraternity Incorporated, founded on Morgan's campus in September 19 of 1963. Next slide. To the commencements and the various honorary degrees that have been bestowed among significant individuals such as Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and the list goes on and on, all occurring on that W.A.C. Hughes Stadium. Next slide. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came in 1958 and was the commencement speaker here. He was conferred an honorary doctorate, but he also shared excerpts from his I Have a Dream speech, which, as many of you know, is his most iconic speech in America. And he was on this campus and on the W.A.C. Hughes Stadium grounds. Next slide. Morgan State College Murphy Auditorium, the former Murphy Auditorium I shared with you, where Malcolm X debates occurred in partnership with Morgan professor Dr. August Meyer. And you can see in these photos the students with with Malcolm X. Next slide. And to many historic figures, hidden figures of our history here at Morgan, Thomas Kaya, who was the last principal of the Princess Anne Academy. Thomas Kaya was very instrumental in supporting the uprise, or rather quieting down the uprise that occurred with the last lynching in Maryland in 1933. Senator Verda Welcome, who graduated from Morgan in 1939, was the first female African-American state senator. She became a state senator here in Maryland, but she became the first African-American female senator. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who lived for more than 2 decades adjacent to this campus in Morgan Park and was also conferred an honorary doctorate by Morgan. To Dr. Regina Goff, who became the first African-American female to be elevated to the highest rank in a presidential cabinet. And to Edward Hurt, our legendary football coach, and Talmadge Hill, legendary basketball coach, to Charles Drew, the Dr. Charles Drew, and to Ida R. Cummings, who was the first African-American female Baltimore City kindergarten teacher, and also our first African-American female member of our board. And to Frank Trigg, who was born and enslaved to the governor of Virginia and became our founding principal of the Virginia Collegiate Industrial College in Lynchburg, Virginia. Next slide. And to more present or recent individuals affiliated with our alumni. Earl Graves Sr., who, as I mentioned, is the founder of the Black Enterprise Magazine, to Chief Justice Robert Bell, to Major General U.S. Army William E. Ward, to David Talbert, who recently spoke here, and many of you probably seen his recent movie last year, and to April Ryan, who will be visiting our campus later this year as well. Next slide. And to our world-renowned Morgan Choir, we thank you for the selections this morning, and we look forward to the Alma Mater later. We still have a prolific history, one that, of course, under the direction of Dr. Nathan Carter, and now under the direction of Dr. Conway, who I believe is still in the audience. Next slide. And to our civil rights legacy, which has been captured in the Student Center, where you will see the original counter and the stools where the first sit-in in the country happened, and by our students in 1955. Next slide. And to the civil rights landmark in Bolton Hill, the Dr. Lily Carroll Jackson House and Civil Rights Museum, which we opened last year. And for those that have not gone to this museum, we encourage you to visit this. It has been pristinely restored, and it tells a remarkable civil rights legacy associated with Baltimore and Dr. Lily Carroll Jackson. Next slide. And to the Spite Wall that many of you drive by on Hillen Road, which is just across from the library, the present Earl Richardson Library. There's a brick wall which looks like it's the back of perhaps some garages, but as you can see in the 1940s, this Spite Wall was going up. As I mentioned, when we came in 1917, there was a lot of opposition around our coming to this campus. The Laurelville community and the surrounding white communities had requested that the mayor condemn this area because it was going to be considered a Negro colony. And there were references that we would taint the very air that one would breathe. And as you can see, in 1940, there was still a wall that was actually being built. The developer building the houses across the street was very concerned that this Negro college would bring down the value of these properties. And so he set about to begin building a wall, but Dr. Holmes was very instrumental in having that wall stopped, and so only a remnant of that wall exists today. And so that brick wall, which is painted red brick, you will see it on Hillen Road. This is known as the Spite Wall. Next slide. To the presidential desk, which is still existing. And as you can see here, President Dr. Jenkins is at that desk in 1948. Next slide. Frederick Douglass statue, 1956. This is the first statue that's erected to Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass is a native Marylander. And on this campus in 1956, through James E. Lewis, a professor on this campus, this statue was hand sculpted, and it is the first statue erected to Frederick Douglass. His native land erected a statue in 2011, just to put this in perspective. And here's Morgan in 1956 erecting a statue to Frederick Douglass. The Welcome Bridge is named in honor of Senator Verda Welcome, class of 1939. Most students think, as they thought when I was a student, that it is a Welcome to Morgan Bridge. It is a bridge named in honor of Senator Verda Welcome. Next slide. Built in 1964. This relief bronze, for those that are in the ROTC, you probably are most familiar with it, and is currently in the Turner's Armory. It was originally in the Soldiers' Armory, which was at the present site of the Student Center today, done by Hun Schuyler in 1952. Next slide. This Negro College mural from 1954 by Charles Stallings is a replica of it is in the present-day Student Center. When you look up very high in that hall space in the Student Center Theater, this is that large image that you see. It was originally in the Memorial Refectory, which is where the present-day Dixon Research Science Center is. However, a replica of it was placed in the new Student Center building. Next slide. The Susie Carr Love Chapel. This is the chapel interior that is named in honor of our first female graduate, Susie Carr Love, 1941. Next slide. And Mcmechen Hall, named in honor of our first graduate of Morgan College in this building in 1972. He graduated in 1895. Next slide. And to the legacy of the black architects that have designed buildings on Morgan's campus, which is most unique, and starting with Albert Cassell, who was born in Towson and became one of the most celebrated African-American architects in the country. His first building was Tubman Hall. However, he designed numerous buildings on the campus. Hilliard Robinson, who studied in Germany, who studied at Harvard University and became a housing expert, designed buildings on the campus. Louis Fry, who received the first Masters of Architecture from Harvard University and whose son and grandson became architects, designed buildings on the campus. And to our very own professor, Leon Bridges, who is noted often as the Dean of Black Architects, has designed an annexation on our campus. And to our most recent African-American architect designed building, our School of Architecture, the Sebus building, designed by Phil Freelon, the father-in-law of our own Professor M.K. Ashante. Next slide. And to our 50,000th graduate, Joseph Jones, who graduated in December of 2016 at our fall commencement. All of these significant aspects of our history are being celebrated all year long during this Sesquicentennial. Next slide. So Morgan, a national treasure. Next slide. I shared this to share and to help you remember Morgan's purpose. Morgan was founded as a Centenary Biblical Institute originally to train young African-American men in the ministry. And as you can see, as of 1878, our first female graduate, Susie Carr Love, joined the institution. And in 1890, it becomes a 4-year liberal arts college. And so we have a remarkable legacy of what was originally called moral and intellectual elevation in terms of how it was originally founded. But our purpose is strong, our purpose is unique, and our purpose is significant, and we should remember that as we traverse the campus. Next slide. We should remember Morgan's progress as you walk the hallowed grounds of this campus, as you call out the names of these buildings or even the names of the structures or the bridges. Know that they are honoring significant African-American individuals who have made contributions not only to this institution, but also to the advancement of our race. And so we should respect Morgan's heritage and we should remember Morgan's progress. Next slide. And we should stand very strongly, not only as alumni and students, but as faculty and as administrators and as neighbors and as supporters of Morgan on its promise. Next slide. This rich heritage is all of our inheritance. Next slide. And its stewardship is all of our responsibilities. As I had opened and I shared from Freedom's Plow, our early founders had their hand on Freedom's Plow, and they held on to Freedom's Plow. And there were many hands that worked in the establishment and the greatness of this institution. And we still, through many hands, support this institution, and we, through many hands, will continue this organization to be great. Next slide. And so as I close, I leave you with a hashtag that I left many with last year: Morgan has always mattered. Thank you. I had my slide.
Thank you to all who have participated so well in this convocation this morning, and thank you for being an attentive and patient audience as well. My accolades to our keynote speaker this morning. Dale Greene amazes me more and more every day. He and I both hail from the eastern shore of Maryland, where most good people come from, but I'm always amazed at how much he knows about the history of Morgan at his age. I know a lot about the history of Morgan at my age, and his age is about, what's less than half my age, isn't it? But somehow he has managed in those short years to learn a great deal about the university. Professor Greene, come forward, please. I'd like to make a presentation on behalf of Dr. David Wilson, president of the university, his presidential citation, the Sesquicentennial Speakers Award. The award reads, Sesquicentennial Lecture Award presented to Dale Glenwood Greene, class of 2005, Assistant Professor of Architecture and Lead Faculty of Historic Preservation. I, David Wilson, President of Morgan State University, congratulate you, Dale Glenwood Greene, for your distinguished achievements as Assistant Professor of Architecture and Lead Faculty of Historic Preservation at Morgan State University. I commend you for being a champion of African American history and culture through your extraordinary research on African American communities in Maryland and on the architectural history of Morgan, resulting in Morgan's being named a national treasure by the National Trust for Historical Preservation. I applaud you for your exemplary role as public scholar through your work with the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture and the Board of Trustees of the Maryland Historical Trust. And I congratulate you on being the inaugural lecturer in Morgan's lecture series of its sesquicentennial celebration. Signed, David Wilson, President of Morgan State University. What happened to the photographer? You'll be a photographer. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us this morning and once again for being such a patient audience. We will now have the singing of the Alma Mater led by the Morgan State University Choir, followed by benediction by the Reverend Dr. Bernard Keels. Thank you again for being with us.
Powerful speech. You ever wonder why God takes you through troubling waters? Things like the spike wall. It simply is because our enemies can't swim. That's how we made it this far. Beloved, look to the mythical Sankofa bird, who while flying forward turns his head backward to remember and to honor from that which he came. You too have a dream, and your dream should not go unnoticed. God knows your dreams. Now dare to dream out loud, so the world may discover what you and your God can do. Release your God-given dreams, so that others may be inspired to keep their dreams alive. To the divine altar of every good and perfect dream, we give all honor, glory, and praise. Amen and amen.